Welcome back to Preparing for the Unexpected. Today we are talking with Mark Carroll about where risk and resilience intersect. Mark, great first segment there, talking about education and training in our industry. Let's move to the scope of continuity and resilience. And first of all, what's your definition of continuity and resilience? A
Um,
loaded question.
it is, Alex, and it's a context question, to be honest. And the short answer is not to cut us off real quick, but I have no idea. I just plain have no idea. All right. I think it varies by organization, and the term, the acronym, et cetera, doesn't tell you anything until you get into a deeper dive into the organization, their needs, what the content is internally, what your role is in addressing that from the demand side. And you've got to probe that to then dig into what continuity means. And again, we get caught up in language and terminology. I'll give you a funny story. Years ago, I was in the barcode data collection business, and I met one of my regional peers, and he was the head of media. And I said, "Oh, Ashby," I said, "then you take care of ads on TV, promotions, publications, all the public, all the media kind of stuff." And he said, "What are you talking about?" He says, "I sell labels. I sell the media we print on. I've got nothing to do with advertising." And I went, "Oh," and in a context perspective, it's pretty damned obvious, pardon my French, but it really is simple. And it's like, oh, I'm thinking this guy is handling TV slots and radio ads. And no, he says, I sell print labels, the media. Okay. So I think you need to probe the issue a little bit. Um, I like to look at continuity, and I like to use the term warm site as my starting point. By that I mean we've been in the business a long time, and we know what a cold site's all about. The desk, the chair, the table, not much more. We kind of know what hot site's all about. Ideally, a failover, quickly responding, etc. But when you hear the warm site, you've got nothing. You've got no clear understanding. You've got to ask more questions because it could be a step away from cold or a step away from hot. And that range is pretty dramatic. So when somebody says they have a warm site, you need to say, okay, now tell me more about it. So continuity in my mind means continuing operations of the firm at all levels. It's top-down strategic. Do we have a viable product? Are we in the right markets? All the high-end stuff that the C-level people need to deal with from a viable business perspective, right down into the operations, which is, can we deliver? Can we manufacture? Can we execute? And everything in between. You can get crushed from a continuity perspective by poor product. You can get crushed by nefarious activities on the books internally. All those things can get in the way of continuity. So it's a broad spectrum that needs to be defined in each and every organization you work in.
And how about resilience?
Um,
What are your thoughts there?
resilience, resilience is the word that's come about the last couple of years, as you know, and I think we're getting behind it more as a marketing and promotional term than we are an actual difference in operation. So I don't see a difference between risk management at the enterprise level and resilience. I think they're effectively two circles that overlap each other almost 100%, and I would argue at 100%. But the reality of it is, I think resilience is that preparation up front for whatever you deal with. It's that risk engineering, it's that hardening, it's that, the locking the doors, lockout tagouts in the factory, cybersecurity, all those preparational activities that take the risk down to a level that you can accept, a risk appetite that you can live with. Then, as we all know, risk can't go to zero. Risk can't be reduced to nothing, and things go bump in the night. And that becomes the recovery activity. The example I like to use in the classroom is anybody who's probably old enough might remember a toy called Stretch Armstrong. In Stretch Armstrong, you could stretch the arms from one end of the room to the other, and he wouldn't snap and break. But if you ever put a slice in the arm with a knife or something, it would rip off and break, in which case you need recovery. And that example is Wolverine. Wolverine comes in and recovers himself. He comes back. So I think resilience is that ability to not have to recover, at a level of high impact or probability, but being able to recover when you have to.
Mm. I like the
Now,
point that you said at the very beginning about the definition of continuity and it putting it in context, and it really depends on the organization. Because I've said the same thing about the term resilience. You know, when people ask me, "What's your definition of resilience?" and I, my response is, "Doesn't matter. What matters is how it's defined within your organization." Stop trying to change, an organization with 1,000 people who have a completely different perspective. If they all think it's bouncing forward, then that's what it is to your organization. If it's bouncing back, that's what it is to your organization. Bouncing up,
yeah,
bouncing down, whatever however they define it, go with it, because that's going to get rid of one of your biggest battles is trying to, get them to start thinking your way. You adapt to their way, and you'll
yes,
get farther.
I would agree. I agree 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do think, in some firms, even today, you've got the historical definition of disaster recovery. Now, we all put that into the mental slot of the IT operation. But in some firms that expanded into continuity, they still consider it to be DR. They still call it, the DR world, which in scope perspective is DR in continuity in my mind. So it's a question of what that scope's all about. Uh, I'll give you another example. I know a lot of operations. If you had this discussion years ago and you said Larry or Mary or Harry is the risk manager, that's the person that dealt with insurance. They dealt with policies, carriers, et cetera, and nothing beyond that. That's
Yeah,
an
yeah,
old frame, but it's the old historical frame, and it still exists, Alex. Not in a lot of volume, but you still find it out there. I know a gentleman who is a great risk manager, and his scope is exactly that: carriers and policies. Would he deal with continuity emergency management? No, that's just not his job, not his charter. Is he wrong for not doing that? No, it's just not within his purview. Somebody else deals with that, and they are not the risk manager.
yeah. So let's look at the role of our current continuity professionals. Um, you've mentioned that we should expand our roles. So how should we expand that beyond looking at a BIA or documenting BCP or running a tabletop type thing? What other things should we be cognizant of and really pay attention to?
I don't know if you've got the ability to expand your role per se. I think you've got to expand the area of need and then make sure that that need is addressed, ideally from an expansion of your role. But I don't think you can simply say, I need to do more or do something different. I think you need to create awareness that somebody says, oh, we get an issue here. And who's got that? Well, we got a continuity disaster recovery risk person. Shouldn't they be doing it? So it's got to be a kind of a second level realization. So when you get into things like I mentioned before, the balance sheet, liquidity risk, exchange rates, succession planning, technology replacement. Those are major, major risk-centric issues for an organization.
Hmm.
I mean, even today, you can't walk a mile without hearing about AI and quantum computing. Who's got their arms around that? Who's looking at that from an impact to the organization perspective? Somebody has to. Ideally, it's you, the person who's handling business recovery, continuity, et cetera, at the overall risk level. But at a minimum, it's got to be somebody. Now, once it's acknowledged and addressed, maybe you can make the case that it should be under an overall risk head, risk organization, chief risk officer. But you can't make that case until there's a realization of a need. And the organization has to recognize a need and then determine how they satisfy that need.
So how does a professional go about making that happen? What kind of
Um,
things should we do or not or stop doing even?
um, I think you ask questions that create a pause on the answer. You ask questions about how would we handle this? How does this work? And if you get a crisp answer, that means somebody's probably on top of it. If you get the stutter and the humna, 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 there's probably a chance of, I think, yeah, ooh, yeah. So I'll give you one case in point example, and I haven't had a good answer for this as I've asked this over the last couple of years. Everybody's moving their environment to cloud. Now, cloud is not new. Cloud has been around since timeshare in the 70s, to be frank. And organizations like ADP outsourced payroll and dealt with it in a non-labeled cloud environment decades ago. But organizations then go to the cloud provider and they assess, okay, how much defense in depth do you have as a cloud provider? Well, I've got failover at 5 sites around the planet, and you don't have to worry about that. And okay, and we test that, and you test that, and everybody's really happy with that. Okay. But at the vendor level or the legal entity level, it's a single point of failure.
Hmm.
It may be Joe's Discount Cloud Shop, and they may have great defense in depth, but it's one party. When a bank closes, they don't close a branch, they close the bank. So when a cloud provider goes chapter 7 or chapter 11, you lose access to that entire vendor base, no matter how many occurrences of the operation take place. So what is your backup when the cloud provider goes dark at that full vendor level? And a lot of organizations have never thought that through. They're like, well, they're in 3 places. No, they're 3 branches of the same bank, and they close down at the same time. And to be honest, even if it's a Chapter 11 protection organization where they're going to come back and be okay, in the interim, what are the personnel doing? They're jumping that ship so fast to make your head spin. And as a result, operationally, there's a good chance you just won't be serviced. So, how will you handle multiple layers to take care of, removing a single point of failure? And a lot of organizations have not thought that through.
I recently had a client who just finished their BIA, and they did a gap analysis with their current ITDRP, the IT side of disaster planning.
Mhm.
And they separated everything as to what was in the cloud and what was on-prem. And
Mhm.
their on-prem list of what was in their disaster recovery plan was 6 or 7 applications. Everything else was in the cloud. And someone asked that exact same question. Well, what happens if this provider goes down? And you could just see everyone kind of looking around the room at each other going, I don't know, what would we do?
Like I just said to you a few minutes ago, it's that pause. When you get a crisp answer and immediately, that's great. When you get the suddenly it's like, I guess we better address that or think through that because we've not thought about
Yeah, yeah, that's true. So, how do you go about addressing those kind of risks, like identifying that kind of thing in that level of risk in your organization? Who should be doing it? How do we get involved? Who leads that charge, and how do we go about identifying those kind of things?
Well, I don't know who leads it because if you're handling disaster recovery continuity, um, you probably don't have that, like I say, within your bailiwick in terms of what you need to do. Um, and you may not get even attention to your question. It might be a whispering in the ear at a senior level and a CFO level or somebody like that, where you can get some attention to it such that it gets raised in a C-level meeting beyond, specifically short-term risk areas, or immediate risk areas. So you've got to get a voice there, and it might be so much, like I say, not just the message, but the voice. It might have to be a more senior voice if you're not in that kind of a role or don't have that relationship. It's also a function of where you are. If you're in a 50-person manufacturing job shop, yeah, you probably have the ability to walk into the CFO's office or the CEO's office and say, "Hey, Mary, hey, Larry, what about this?" But if you're in a 5,000, 10,000 employee site around the world, there's a good chance you don't walk in the CEO's office on a given Monday and say, "What do you think?" So I
Yeah.
think you've got to get that question raised. You've got to get that issue brought forward, whether you raise it or not. Um, and I know I shouldn't say it this way, but maybe put it in writing. Put it in a question on an email where somebody has to think it through. I mean, the hallway conversations just dissipate and disappear, and go away, dismissive answers and the like. But when it's raised in a not confrontational, but in a questioning email, um, then somebody has to think about it because, believe it or not, that's discoverable. And if you've got a problem later on something that was raised and dismissed, then there's a good chance you could have some degree of liability there. And people on the receiving end of that know that and really need to get their arms around it as a result.
I'm glad you said that because even I'm sure many listeners and viewers, and including myself, have been in the
Mm.
position where we have raised something, sending an email, and as it starts going up the chain, if it goes up the chain, the message gets watered down or it eventually just disappears. Oh, we don't
Yeah,
want to freak out Jane, the CEO, because she doesn't like hearing those kind of things. So we keep
mm,
that away from her. You know, um,
agree.
that happens to all of us. And
Yes,
it can be very frustrating. And as you say, when something happens, watch out.
right. But to be honest, just because you or I were to raise it doesn't mean it's valid, doesn't mean it's credible. What you really want to do is raise it to a point where somebody thinks it through, puts it through that credibility lens, and says, "There's a case for action here," or Mark, Alex, there's not. And here's out the logic as to why. We've already got that covered, and here's why. Or that's a small piece of our world, minimal disruption, whatever it happens to be. But there may be a logical reason not to embrace the problem. But we don't know that in many cases. Somebody else should, and that logical reason is as important, more important than the this dismissiveness, I should say.
Yeah.
You don't want to dismiss it. You don't want to simply let it go away, but you want to make sure it gets thought through and accepted or rejected.
Yeah, I think that's some of the challenge that we often encounter, though. We bring something forward and it is dismissed. Oh, don't worry about that. Someone else has it. Well, okay, but they may be looking at it from a different perspective than, or maybe I've communicated it incorrectly so that it's not coming
Right, right,
across the way it should. So
right.
I guess there's a delicate balance there to get that right.
Right. And I would add one more piece, and that is the independence role. Uh, from the historically from the audit perspective, for example, audit organizations need to be independent within an organization because if they report into finance operations, whatever, there's a good chance that they'll audit the heck out of everything that's not finance and and softball the finance side if that's their reporting relationship. So
Yeah,
there is a school of thought, and it's very strongly held, may not be as embraced as it is held, but there is a school of thought that audit needs to be operationally independent. So it can audit the organization equally at all levels and not have to kowtow to its own management reporting relationship.
right. On that note, we've come to the end of our second segment. We are talking with Mark Carroll today about risk and resilience and how they intersect, and we will be right back.
Thank you, Alex.